A violent thug beat a 78-year-old widow across the face at her own husband's funeral, and every witness stood frozen in terror. The cemetery was packed with mourners, yet not a single person dared to move. Everyone stood motionless, their eyes wide, their breaths caught in their throats, terrified to speak or even blink. The bully towered over her, grinning like he owned the whole city, convinced he was some kind of unstoppable ruler whose cruelty no one would challenge. But at that moment, he made the biggest mistake of his life. He had no clue that her son was the most feared mafia boss in Chicago, and he was only minutes away from arriving. Before we begin, don't forget to hit like, repost, or share and subscribe. And I'm really curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Back to the story. The funeral procession had just reached the burial site when the rain started. Marco Moretti stepped out of a black Cadillac Escalade wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, Italian leather shoes, and dark sunglasses despite the gray sky. Four men in identical suits emerged behind him, their movements synchronized and professional. Marco wasn't expecting trouble. He had only come home to bury his father, hoping to pay his respects quietly before returning to his empire downtown. But he immediately sensed something was wrong. His lead bodyguard, Vincent, stopped dead, hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Marco followed Vincent's stare and his blood turned to ice in his veins. His mother, Martha Moretti, was on the ground beside the grave, trembling as she held her cheek. A massive man with a scarred face and leather jacket stood towering above her. Marco didn't breathe, didn't blink. He simply stepped forward. "Mom." His voice was calm. Too calm. The bully, known around the South Side as Ricky the Hammer Donovan, turned slowly. "Oh, look," he sneered. The old ladies got back up. Vincent and the other three bodyguards fanned out silently, cutting off every cemetery exit. The air grew thick with tension that made several mourners step back instinctively. Marco walked through the parted crowd, his approach deliberate and unhurried. He knelt beside his mother, touching her shoulder with infinite gentleness. "Did he hit you?" She tried to shake her head, but blood trickled from her lip. "Marco, don't do anything foolish." Ricky laughed, loud and mocking. "Yeah, listen to her, rich boy. Walk away like everyone else before you find yourself in the ground next to Daddy." Marco rose to his full height. He wasn't as physically imposing as Ricky, but he had that unmistakable presence, controlled, lethal, unreadable. The kind of stillness that came from having ordered men's deaths with a phone call. Vincent stood at his right shoulder, hand inside his jacket now, waiting for one signal. Marco said quietly, "Vincent." His bodyguard stepped back, but his eyes stayed locked on Ricky like a predator marking prey. Marco stepped forward, but before he could reach Ricky, the scene he'd just interrupted suddenly made terrifying sense. 20 minutes earlier, the rain had started as Father O'Brien began the final prayers. Martha stood at the edge of the grave, clutching her white rose, tears mixing with raindrops on her weathered face. 50 mourners surrounded her, neighbors, old friends, people who'd known Thomas Moretti for decades. The ceremony was beautiful, sacred, everything Tommy deserved. Then Ricky the Hammer Donovan shoved his way through the crowd. "E.Y. Moretti." His voice shattered the funeral silence like a brick through stained glass. Heads turned in shock. Father O'Brien's prayer died on his lips. Ricky pushed past Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Park, his massive frame cutting through mourners like they were nothing. "Your dead husband owed me $5,000, Ricky announced, stopping directly in front of Martha. "Time to pay up, old lady." Martha's face went pale. Her hands trembled around the rose stem. "Please, not here, not today." "I don't care if it's Christmas," Ricky snarled, leaning down into her personal space. "You got 1 week to get me my money, or I'm burning down that little house of yours on Polk Street. You understand me?" An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd, Henry Chin, 76, who'd run the restaurant next to Tommy's Grocery for 40 years. His voice shook but held firm. "Have some respect. This is a funeral." Ricky's backhand was lightning fast and brutally efficient. The crack of knuckles against his skull echoed through the cemetery. Henry's head snapped sideways, and he crumpled against a marble headstone, blood immediately streaming from a gash on his scalp. His wife screamed. Gasps rippled through the mourners, but not a single person moved to help. They'd all seen what happened to people who challenged Ricky Donovan. Fear paralyzed them completely. Shop owners who'd paid his protection money. Neighbors who'd watched him terrorize the South Side for 3 years. Witnesses who'd stayed silent because silence meant survival. Martha's voice wavered as she tried again. "My husband never borrowed money from anyone. He ran an honest business." "You calling me a liar?" Ricky grabbed her by the collar of her black coat, yanking her forward. His scarred face was inches from hers. "You calling me a liar at your husband's funeral?" "No, I just—" The slap came without warning. The crack echoed across the cemetery like a gunshot. Martha's head whipped to the side, her black veil flying off. She collapsed onto the wet grass beside her husband's grave, blood trickling from her split lip. The white rose fell from her hand into the mud beside Thomas's casket. The crowd recoiled in collective horror, but still, no one moved. 50 witnesses. Not one intervention. Ricky stood over Martha's crumpled form, grinning triumphantly. This was his kingdom. These were his subjects. Fear was his crown. One weak old lady. He adjusted his leather jacket, preparing to leave. "And tell that son of yours, wherever the hell he is, that his mama's gonna be homeless unless I get paid." He turned his back on her, swagger in every step. Then the sound cut through the rain, smooth, expensive, unmistakable. A car engine, powerful and deliberate. A black Cadillac Escalade appeared on the cemetery road, tinted windows reflecting the gray sky. No one had noticed its arrival. The vehicle rolled forward with predatory patience, stopping 30 feet from the burial site. Ricky didn't notice, still focused on intimidating the crowd with his exit. But the mourners' attention shifted. Whispers started. The Escalade's engine idled. Waiting. Then a voice cut through the rain, cold, calm, and absolutely lethal. "Touch her again, and you're going in the ground next to my father." Every head turned. The driver's door opened. Silence fell like a hammer. Marco Moretti stepped out of the Escalade like death itself taking human form. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most of the mourners earned in a month. His dark hair was slicked back with precision, every strand in place despite the rain. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the walk of a man who'd never had to rush because the world waited for him. But it was his eyes that made the air itself seem colder. Flat. Dark. Empty of mercy. That unmistakable stillness that came from absolute power, controlled, lethal, unreadable. The kind of calm that preceded violence so surgical it left no witnesses. Behind him, 4 men emerged from the Escalade in identical dark suits. Their jackets hung strangely, bulging in unmistakable places near their ribs and shoulders. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. They fanned out with military precision, movements synchronized like a tactical unit. One moved toward the cemetery's east entrance. Another positioned himself near the main gate. The third and fourth created a perimeter that silently, efficiently cut off every possible exit. Strategic positioning. Professional execution. This wasn't random muscle. This was trained, disciplined, lethal. Marco walked forward through the parted crowd of mourners. People stepped aside instinctively, creating a path without being asked. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the gathering like electricity. "Moretti, that's Marco Moretti." "Wait, the Marco Moretti? Oh my God." Recognition spread like wildfire through the cemetery. Everyone in Chicago knew the Moretti name. The family that controlled the docks, construction contracts, half the city council. political connections that stretched from aldermen to judges to the state legislature. An organization so powerful that even the FBI couldn't touch them, not for lack of trying, but for lack of witnesses willing to testify. But Martha had kept her maiden name after marrying Thomas. She'd lived quietly on Polk Street, far removed from her son's empire. A deliberate separation for both their protection, her from his world, him from anyone who might use her as leverage. No one had connected the sweet, elderly widow to the Moretti family. Until now. Ricky tried to maintain his bravado, but his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there seconds ago. Who the hell are? The words died in his throat as he finally noticed the four suited men surrounding the cemetery, hands resting inside their jackets. His eyes darted from one to another, calculating exits that no longer existed. Understanding began to dawn on his scarred face. The expensive car. The coordinated backup. The way every mourner had gone silent. He'd made a mistake. A catastrophic one. Marco stopped 10 feet from Ricky. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried absolute authority through the cemetery, reaching every ear despite the rain. I'm her son. 3 words. Each syllable weighted with the promise of violence. And you just made the last mistake of your miserable life. Ricky's face drained of color completely. The scarred, confident bully from moments ago transformed before everyone's eyes into something smaller, more vulnerable. His hands began trembling. Sweat mixed with rain on his forehead. Stories flooded his mind, the rumors everyone on the South Side whispered about but never repeated too loudly. Bodies found in the Chicago River with no identification. Rivals who simply disappeared. Businesses that burned down after refusing Moretti partnerships. And worse, the stories about what Marco Moretti did personally to people who showed him disrespect. Listen, man, I didn't know. Ricky's voice cracked, eyes darting desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. I swear I didn't know she was. But Vincent stood blocking the east path. Another suit guarded the main gate. The third had positioned himself near the tree line. The fourth stood beside the escalade, hand inside his jacket, watching everything. Ricky was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, surrounded by predators who operated on a level of violence he'd only pretended to understand. Marco took one measured step forward. The rain continued falling, drops hitting Thomas Moretti's casket with soft, rhythmic patters. Martha remained on the ground where she'd fallen, blood on her lip, black veil in the mud beside her. She watched her son approach the man who'd struck her, and something in her expression said she'd seen this before, this transformation, this cold fury barely contained. The funeral crowd held its collective breath. 50 witnesses to what came next. Marco stopped walking. He simply stood there, studying Ricky the way a scientist might examine an insect pinned to a board, with clinical detachment and mild curiosity about how long it would survive. You didn't know? Each word was perfectly enunciated, delivered with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. His voice remained quiet, barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than any scream could have been. You didn't know you don't put your hands on a woman? He took one step to the right, beginning to circle. You didn't know you don't disrespect the dead? Another step. Slow. Predatory. A shark assessing prey. Or did you think you were untouchable? Because you terrorize people too scared to fight back. Each question stripped away another layer of Ricky's remaining courage like a blade peeling away skin. The crowd watched, mesmerized by the complete reversal of power happening before their eyes. The bully who'd ruled through fear now being dissected psychologically by someone who understood violence on a level Ricky had never imagined. The physical contrast was almost comical. Ricky stood 6'4", 240 pounds of muscle built from years of brutality. Marco was maybe 6 feet, leaner, his power coming not from size, but from something far more dangerous. Presence. Authority. Reputation. Physical size meant nothing here. Ricky could have snapped Marco in half in a fair fight. But this wasn't a fair fight. This was a child being caught by an angry god, and they both knew it. Marco completed his circle, stopping 2 feet directly in front of Ricky. He made direct eye contact, unblinking, his dark eyes boring into Ricky's soul. "Get on your knees." The command was spoken quietly, almost conversationally. But it was loaded with such contained violence that Ricky's legs actually weakened beneath him. What Ricky tried to maintain some shred of dignity. His eyes darted around the crowd, searching for support, for anyone who might intervene. But no one met his gaze. The neighborhood that had feared him for 3 years now watched his humiliation with rapt attention. "I ain't kneeling for nobody. Get on your knees." For words, delivered with such quiet violence that something broke inside Ricky. Not shouted, not screamed. Controlled. Inevitable. Like gravity itself commanding obedience. Behind Marco, all 4 suited men took a single synchronized step closer. The sound of their shoes on wet grass seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Ricky's legs buckled involuntarily. He dropped to the muddy ground beside Martha's fallen white rose, his knees sinking into the wet cemetery grass with a squelch that seemed to echo. The man who'd terrorized the South Side, who'd beaten shop owners and threatened families, who'd strutted through these streets like a king, brought to his knees without a single punch being thrown. His reign of terror was ending at this moment, and everyone watching knew it. Tears were already forming in his eyes before Marco even touched him. Marco crouched down slowly, bringing himself face to face with Ricky. Close enough that the others couldn't hear his words. Close enough that Ricky could see his own terrified reflection in Marco's flat, dead eyes. "You're going to apologize to my mother." Marco's voice was barely a whisper, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "You're going to return every dollar you've stolen from this neighborhood. Every single dollar." He paused, letting that sink in. "And then you're leaving Chicago and never coming back." Ricky nodded frantically, tears streaming down his scarred face, mixing with rain and snot. "Yes, yes, I swear." Marco's voice dropped even lower, becoming something almost inhuman. "Because if I ever see your face again." The pause stretched out. 5 seconds. 10. Letting Ricky's imagination complete the threat with something far worse than words could convey. "They'll need dental records to identify you." It wasn't hyperbole. It wasn't some dramatic posturing. It was an absolute promise delivered with the certainty of someone who'd made good on such promises before. All of Ricky's bravado shattered completely. The man who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood was sobbing openly now, his massive frame shaking with the force of his breakdown. I'm sorry, Mrs. Moretti." The words tumbled out between sobs, desperate and pathetic. "I swear I didn't know. Please, I'll leave. I'll pay everything back. Please don't kill me." Marco remained crouched, perfectly still, staring into Ricky's eyes without blinking. Rain ran down both their faces. The funeral crowd watched in absolute silence as justice was delivered without a single punch thrown, without a single drop of blood spilled. 50 witnesses to the moment fear finally met something more powerful than itself. Marco remained crouched at Ricky's level, his expression unchanging. Rain continued falling between them, but neither man seemed to notice. Louder. One word. A single command that carried the weight of absolute authority. He wanted everyone to witness this. Needed the neighborhood to hear the bully humbled, to see with their own eyes that fear could be broken. This wasn't just about his mother. This was about every person Ricky had terrorized for 3 years. "I'm sorry." Ricky's voice cracked as it echoed through the cemetery, raw and desperate. Tears mixed with rain streaming down his scarred face, snot running from his nose. The man who'd walked these streets like a king was sobbing on his knees in the mud. "I'll return everything, every dollar I took." The words poured out in a panicked rush. "I'll leave Chicago tonight, I swear on my life. Please, please don't kill me." All menace had evaporated. The swagger, the threats, the violence, all of it stripped away, leaving only a terrified man begging for his life. The mourners watched in stunned silence. 3 years of terror ending in mere moments. Mrs. Rodriguez remembered Ricky demanding protection money every week outside her bakery. Mr. Park recalled the night Ricky smashed his restaurant windows for being 2 days late with payment. Henry Chin, still bleeding from his scalp wound, watched the man who'd struck him reduced to tears. Ricky's victims were finally seeing justice delivered. But Marco wasn't finished. Everyone here. His voice remained quiet, controlled. Look at them. Ricky's head turned, his bloodshot eyes scanning the crowd of mourners surrounding him. Apologize to every person in this cemetery. The command made the punishment complete. Public. Permanent. This moment would be remembered, retold, become legend. The day Ricky the Hammer Donovan broke. Ricky turned to face the crowd fully, still on his knees in the mud and grass. His voice was hoarse, defeated, desperate. I'm sorry to all of you. He started naming people between sobs, pointing with a shaking hand. Mr. Chen, I'm sorry for hitting you. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm sorry for threatening your family. Mr. Park, your restaurant, I'm sorry. Everyone, I'm so sorry. His voice cracked and broke, words dissolving into incoherent sobbing. Then Martha's voice cut through the scene, firm despite her injuries. Marco, that's enough. Not fearful. Not pleading. She knew her son, understood what he was capable of. But she also recognized that the punishment had been delivered, the lesson learned. Any more would cross a line even she couldn't allow. Marco stood immediately. The lethal focus vanished from his eyes as if a switch had been flipped. His expression softened completely as he turned to his mother. He helped her to her feet with infinite gentleness, the same hands that had just promised death now cradling her like the most delicate porcelain. Easy, Ma. I've got you. He brushed mud from her black coat with careful attention, retrieved her fallen veil and the white rose from where they'd landed. His movements were tender, protective, the dangerous predator transformed back into a devoted son. Are you hurt? The concern in his voice was genuine, raw. He touched her face gently, examining where Ricky had struck her. Does it hurt badly? Martha reached up and touched his cheek, her weathered hand against his rain-wet skin. I'm all right now. 2 words that said everything. Now. Because he was here. Because she was safe. Marco didn't even look at Ricky again. He simply said quietly, not taking his eyes off his mother, "Get him out of my sight." The 4 suited men moved instantly, with practiced efficiency. Vincent and another grabbed Ricky under his arms and hauled him upright. His legs barely supported his weight. They began dragging him toward a black sedan that had appeared at the cemetery's edge, one of the backup vehicles, prepared for exactly this purpose. I'll leave tonight, I swear. Ricky's voice faded as the distance increased, still sobbing, still begging. Please don't kill me, please, I'll disappear. You'll never see me again. A car door opened. He was shoved inside. The door slammed with a finality that seemed to echo across the cemetery. The engine started. The black sedan pulled away slowly, deliberately. Through the rear window, Ricky was visible, head down, shoulders shaking. The man who'd terrorized the South Side for 3 years was leaving broken, destroyed, humiliated. Not by violence, not by brutality, but by meeting someone more powerful than fear itself. The cemetery fell silent except for the rain. Marco held his mother close, one arm supporting her. Everyone watched, processing what they'd just witnessed. Father O'Brien cleared his throat nervously, preparing to continue the funeral service. Marco gently guided Martha back to the graveside, his arm supporting her weight as they walked. Father O'Brien stood frozen, uncertain whether to continue, his prayer book trembling slightly in his hands. The elderly priest had witnessed something that existed outside his understanding of proper funeral protocol. Marco met his eyes and nodded with quiet respect. Please, Father. Finish the service. It was a request, not a command. Despite everything that had just happened, Marco showed deference to the ceremony, to his father, to the community gathered here. Father O'Brien nodded gratefully and opened his prayer book again. The mourners slowly returned to their positions around the grave, but everything had changed. The air felt different, lighter somehow, despite the rain. Whispers spread through the crowd like ripples across water. That was Marco Moretti. The Moretti family. No wonder Ricky ran like that. Did you see his eyes? I've never seen anything like that. Father O'Brien cleared his throat and resumed the prayers, though his voice shook noticeably. Eternal rest grant unto Thomas, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. Martha stood beside Marco, his arms still supporting her. She clutched the white rose she'd retrieved, muddy now, but still hers to give. The rain was beginning to lighten to a drizzle, as if even the weather recognized that something fundamental had shifted. May he rest in peace. Amen. The cemetery workers operated the mechanism, and Thomas Moretti's casket began its final descent into the earth. Martha stepped forward to the edge of the grave. For a moment she simply stood there, staring down at the mahogany coffin that held her husband of 52 years. Then she tossed the white rose. It tumbled through the air and landed perfectly on the casket's center. Goodbye, my love, she whispered, so quietly only Marco heard. 52 years of marriage ending in this moment. But she was surrounded by a protection she hadn't felt in years, not just from her son, but from the entire community that had been freed from fear. Marco watched his father being buried, his jaw clenched tight against the emotion threatening to break through. He hadn't arrived in time to say goodbye, hadn't been there when his father took his last breath. The guilt of that pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The first tears appeared in his eyes. Martha noticed immediately, her mother's instinct never dimmed by age. She touched his arm gently. He knew you loved him, Marco. He always knew. Something broke inside him. Marco knelt suddenly in the mud beside his father's grave, not caring about his expensive suit, not caring who watched. The powerful Mafia boss, the man whose name made politicians sweat and rivals disappear, wept openly at his father's funeral. He placed his hand on the edge of the burial plot, his fingers digging into the wet earth. I'm sorry, Pop. I should have been here. His voice cracked. I should have been here sooner. Martha's hand settled on his shoulder, grounding him. The neighborhood watched this moment of raw vulnerability. Marco Moretti, feared across Chicago, whispered about in back rooms and courthouses, crying at his father's funeral like anyone else. A son mourning his father. Nothing more, nothing less. It reminded everyone watching of their shared humanity. Mr. Chin approached slowly, hand pressed to the wound on his scalp where Ricky had struck him. Blood had stopped flowing, but the damage was visible. He stopped beside Marco and spoke softly. Your father was a good man, Marco. Best neighbor I ever had. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward next, her eyes red from crying. Tommy spoke of you with such pride. Always. Every time we talked. Others began joining them, offering condolences, sharing memories of Thomas, forming a circle around mother and son. Mr. Park mentioned how Tommy had given him his first business loan. Mrs. Kim talked about Tommy helping her family when they first immigrated. Story after story, memory after memory. The community was embracing Martha and Marco, 50 mourners united not in terror, but in genuine grief and relief. The fear that had dominated this neighborhood lifted like fog and sunlight. For the first time in 3 years, people stood together in mutual support rather than shared paralysis. Father O'Brien raised his hand for the final blessing. May his soul, and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen, echoed through the crowd, genuine and heartfelt. The sign of the cross. The benediction is complete. The service officially ended. People began moving slowly toward their cars, but many lingered, wanting to speak to Martha, to pay their respects. Some caught Marco's eye, nodding with understanding that needed no words. Things that couldn't be spoken aloud but passed in glances. Marco helped Martha toward the escalade, Vincent falling into step behind them protectively. She paused at the cemetery path, looking back at her husband's grave one final time. "Your father would be proud of you today," she said quietly. Marco said nothing, but his grip on her arm tightened gently. The small brick home on Polk Street looked exactly as Marco remembered, modest, well-maintained, with flower boxes in the windows that his mother tended religiously. His 4 men had positioned themselves discreetly around the property, Vincent by the front entrance, 2 others covering the side and back, the 4th in a car down the street with clear sight lines. Inside, the kitchen was warm and filled with family photos covering every available surface. Pictures of Marco as a child, his father in younger days behind the grocery counter, holidays and birthdays spanning decades. The visual history of a normal family in a neighborhood where normal families tried to survive. Martha immediately began making coffee despite Marco's protests that she should rest. "I've been making coffee in this kitchen for 40 years, she said firmly. "A split lip isn't going to stop me now." It was the first time they'd been alone together in 6 months. Marco had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He sat at the same kitchen table where he'd done homework as a child, where his father had taught him to play cards, where countless family dinners had unfolded in simpler times. Martha's lip was swelling where Ricky had struck her. An ice pack and first aid kit sat between them on the table, the physical evidence of why this reunion had happened at all. "How did you know about the funeral?" Martha asked as she poured coffee into 2 mugs, Marco's old favorite, the one with the Cubs logo, nearly faded away. The question carried a gentle accusation that only mothers could deliver. "I called you 3 days ago. You didn't answer." She set his mug in front of him. "You're always busy with your business." She never called it what it was. Never acknowledged the empire explicitly. That small kindness, that willful blindness, was her way of keeping part of her son clean. Marco wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "I was in New York. Business you don't want to know about." He checked his messages late last night and heard her voicemail about his father passing away. The funeral was scheduled for this morning, short notice, but that was how Tommy had wanted it. No fuss, no delays. "I drove straight through. 7 hours. Marco met her eyes. "I wasn't going to miss Pop's funeral. I got here just as the service started. Stayed back initially, didn't want to make it about me. But then that man." Martha's voice trailed off. She sat down across from him, pressing the ice pack gently to her lip. "Tell me about him," Marco said quietly. "The truth." Martha sighed. "Your father never owed anyone money, Marco. Not a dollar. That man, Ricky Donovan, just wanted an excuse to intimidate me. To show the neighborhood he could do whatever he wanted, even at a funeral." She explained the 3 years of terror. How Ricky had systematically extorted every shop owner on Ashland Avenue. How he beat anyone who resisted. How witnesses were too terrified to testify. How the police couldn't stop him without cooperation from the community. "Everyone was afraid," Martha said simply. "Including me." Marco's fist clenched on the table, knuckles going white. "I should have killed him." Martha reached across and covered his hand with hers, small, weathered, but still possessing a mother's strength. "No, you did the right thing. He hit you. And you showed everyone that fear can be broken without becoming a monster yourself." Her voice was firm. "That matters, Marco. That matters more than you know." She explained her choice to keep distance from his world over the years. "I wanted you to know you always have a clean place to return to. A home without violence, without that life. Somewhere you could just be my son." Marco's eyes glistened. "But I brought violence here today anyway. You brought protection. There's a difference." Martha squeezed his hand. "You're my son first, whatever else you are second. That never changes." She talked about Thomas's pride in Marco, despite everything. How his father understood that sometimes people born into certain families had limited choices. "He knew you took a dark path so others wouldn't have to," Martha said. "The neighborhood is safer because of you, even if they don't know it." The Moretti legacy was complicated. Thomas had run a legitimate grocery for 40 years, deliberately separating himself from the family business. But Marco's grandfather, the original Marco Moretti, had built the empire that still bore their name. When Marco's uncle died unexpectedly, 25-year-old Marco had inherited an organization he'd tried to avoid. He'd attempted legitimate business first. It hadn't lasted. "Sometimes good men do hard things," Martha said quietly. Marco nodded slowly. "I'll make sure the neighborhood stays safe. Not just from Ricky, from everyone. Word will spread about what happened today." He met her eyes. "No one will touch you or anyone here again." "That's a promise." Martha asked the question Marco had been avoiding. "What happens to that man?" "To Ricky? He leaves Chicago, like I said." "And if he doesn't?" Marco's silence answered everything. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Evening sun was breaking through the clouds, casting golden light across the kitchen. A new beginning for the neighborhood, perhaps. But for Marco, it was the same old patterns, the same old life. Just with one more thing to protect. Word traveled through the South Side like wildfire. By evening, O'Malley's bar on Ashland Avenue was packed with witnesses, everyone nursing drinks and sharing their version of what had happened at Sacred Heart Cemetery. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and excited voices, all talking over each other. "I was there, I saw everything. You should have seen his face when Marco stepped out of that car. Best thing I've ever witnessed in my life." Mr. Chin sat at the bar, showing off his scalp wound to anyone who would look. What had been a source of shame this morning, being struck down, unable to defend himself, had transformed into a badge of honor by nightfall. "That Moretti boy, he stood up for all of us," Chin said, accepting another beer from the bartender. "Made that animal kneel in the mud and cry like a baby." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically from her table. "Did you see Ricky's face? Tears and snot running down, begging for his life. After 3 years of terrorizing us, brought down in 5 minutes. The stories were already growing, becoming legend with each retelling. Truth and fiction blurred together in the comfortable darkness of the bar. Marco had 10 men with machine guns surrounding the whole cemetery. "I heard he broke Ricky's jaw with one punch." No, Ricky left in an ambulance, not a car. Paramedics had to sedate him." The truth was dramatic enough, but legends always needed embellishment. At 9 p.m. by Greyhound bus station, Ricky Donovan stood at gate 7, boarding pass clutched in his shaking hand. One duffel bag held his entire life now, clothes, some cash, nothing else. He'd abandoned his apartment, his car, everything that tied him to Chicago. The bus to Milwaukee was boarding. He kept looking over his shoulder, scanning every shadow, every person in the terminal. Any one of them could be Moretti's men. Every businessman in a suit made his heart race. Every stranger's glance felt like surveillance. He climbed onto the bus, chose a seat in the back, and didn't stop shaking until they crossed the Wisconsin state line an hour later. The next morning, the victims began emerging from years of silence, comparing stories at the same bar where celebrations had happened the night before. Shop owners who'd paid Ricky's protection money calculated what they'd lost over 3 years. Mrs. Kim from the dry cleaners, $300 every month for 2 years. That's $7,200. Mr. Patel from the liquor store, $500 monthly for 18 months. $9,000. On and on it went. The total approached $50,000 stolen from a neighborhood that could barely afford it. But the next morning, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Kim found an envelope under her door. Inside was $7,200 in cash, plus an additional $1,400. Exactly 20% extra. No note. No explanation needed. Mr. Patel discovered the same thing. $9,000 plus $1,800. Every single victim of Ricky's extortion found envelopes that morning. Exact restitution plus interest. Everyone knew the source, but no one spoke the name aloud. Some gifts were better left unacknowledged. At the police headquarters, 2nd District, Detective Sarah Morrison reviewed the incident reports from Sacred Heart Cemetery, her partner reading over her shoulder. Multiple witnesses to an altercation, she read aloud. Assault on an elderly woman. But the victim doesn't want to file charges. Her partner, Detective James Walsh, shrugged. The perpetrator left town permanently. Witnesses confirm he got in a car voluntarily and departed. No weapons drawn, no actual violence from the responding party. The responding party being Marco Moretti, who was attending his father's funeral and stopped an assault in progress. Walsh closed the file. Case closed, Sarah. Some justice happens outside courtrooms. Morrison didn't respond, but she understood. There was an understanding between the police and the Moretti family, unspoken, but real. Lines that didn't get crossed on either side. At City Hall, Alderman Frank DeLuca's office received word by noon. His call to Marco was brief, carefully worded. Thank you for cleaning up the neighborhood situation. A delicate political dance, acknowledging without endorsing. Your father was a good man, Marco. The neighborhood will miss him. The neighborhood is under my protection now, Marco replied simply. Message received. Message understood. At FBI field office, Agent Michael Torres added another entry to the Moretti file, then closed it with frustration. Nothing here could be prosecuted. A bully had left town voluntarily after a verbal confrontation at a funeral. No assault charges. No weapons. No crime that could be proven in court. Legally clean. Frustratingly so. At Marco's penthouse in the midnight, Vincent's report came through encrypted channels. Ricky confirmed on the bus to Wisconsin. The neighborhood is celebrating quietly. No retaliation threats. Situation resolved. Boss, your mother is safe. Area secure. Marco stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago, sipping whiskey, watching city lights spread to the horizon. His empire seen from above. He called Martha. Everything all right? Perfect. Thank you again. Always, Ma. Always. He ended the call just as his business phone rang, operations calling, problems requiring attention, the empire demanding its due. Back to work. Back to the life he'd inherited. But part of his mind would always be on Polk Street now, watching over that small brick house with flower boxes in the windows. Protecting home. 2 weeks later, Martha returned to Sacred Heart Cemetery on a bright morning that felt like a different world from the funeral. The rain had given way to sunshine, warm and gentle. Grass was already growing over Thomas's burial site, nature reclaiming the disturbed earth. She placed fresh flowers, white roses, always white roses, and stood in peaceful silence. The cemetery felt safe now. Transformed. Walking home along Ashland Avenue, Martha noticed the changes everywhere. Shop owners stood outside their businesses, smiling, relaxed, chatting with customers without constantly glancing over their shoulders. Children played on the sidewalks again, their parents watching but not hovering fearfully. Mr. Chen's restaurant had a line out the door. People felt safe enough to go out for dinner again. The atmosphere was completely different. As if the neighborhood had been holding its breath for 3 years and finally exhaled. Martha stopped at the corner store, Tommy's old location, though new owners had taken over after he retired 5 years ago. The young couple who ran it now greeted her warmly and refused payment when she brought groceries to the counter. Your husband was an institution here, Mrs. Moretti, the wife said, pushing Martha's money back across the counter. This neighborhood wouldn't be what it is without him. The husband added quietly, and your son, well, we're grateful. That's all we can say. Martha nodded, understanding what couldn't be spoken aloud. The black Escalade pulled up to Martha's house that Sunday afternoon, but this time it received a warm welcome instead of fearful stares. Neighbors waved. Children approached curiously, asking Marco about the car, and he was patient and kind, showing them a side no one at the cemetery would have recognized. He even helped elderly Mr. Park carry groceries inside, taking the heavy bags without being asked. Inside Martha's home, they resumed the Sunday dinner tradition that had lapsed during Thomas's illness. Marco had changed from his business suit into jeans and a sweater, casual, comfortable, just a son visiting his mother. They cooked together, following family recipes, making Tommy's favorites. The kitchen was filled with the smell of marinara sauce and garlic bread. Photos of Thomas covered every surface, and they shared memories as they worked. Laughter echoed through the small house. Normalcy. Healing. You know you changed things that day, Martha said as they sat down to eat. Marco shrugged. I just protected my mother. No, you gave people their courage back. Martha set down her fork, making sure he heard this. Fear controlled them for 3 years. You broke that control. They remember what it feels like to not be afraid. Marco considered this perspective, silent for a moment. He tried to explain his world carefully. Most of what I do, you don't want to know about. But I can use that power to protect what matters. This neighborhood. You. The people Pop cared about. Just don't lose yourself completely, Martha said softly. Your father worried about that. He wanted you to remember there's more to life than power and protection. Sometimes I wonder what life I could have had. Marco stared at his plate. Different choices. Legitimate business. Normal family. Regular Sunday dinners without bodyguards outside. You have a family. You have me. Martha reached across and squeezed his hand. And you protect hundreds of people, whether they know it or not. That counts for something, Marco. That counts for a lot. A knock interrupted the moment. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the door with a container of homemade tamales, still warm. She thanked Marco personally, then hugged Martha tight. First time in 3 years, I'm not afraid in my own home, she whispered. Thank you. Thank your son. The pattern repeated throughout the afternoon. Neighbors visiting, bringing food, thanking them without saying exactly what for. The community was rebuilding itself, connection by connection. Evening found Martha and Marco on the front porch, watching neighborhood kids play street hockey in the fading light. Parents chatted on stoops, relaxed and laughing. Life as it should be. Your father loved this view, Martha said. Marco watched the scene, the normalcy, the peace, the community thriving. I understand why now. I'll check in more often, he promised. Every Sunday dinner, if I can manage it. I'd like that. And if anyone ever threatens this neighborhood again. I know. Martha smiled slightly. They'll answer to you. Comfortable silence settled between them, understanding reached without further words needed. Marco's phone buzzed, business calling, always calling. He kissed Martha's cheek and headed toward the Escalade where Vincent waited. She watched him leave, waving as the black vehicle pulled away. She turned back to the house. Through the window, Thomas's photo was visible in its place of honor on the mantel. He did good, Tommy, she whispered. Our boy did good. The cemetery stood silent that evening as shadows grew long across Thomas Moretti's grave. The white rose Martha had placed there that morning still looked fresh, untouched by wind or time. Nearby, a cardinal sang its evening song, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. The south side slept peacefully for the first time in 3 years, protected not by law or chance, but by the quiet promise of a son who'd returned home just in time. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing a bully can do is underestimate a mother's love and the lengths to which her son will go to protect it.